Hello to all lovers of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. If you enjoy stories that send chills down your spine and keep you awake at night, get ready, because this one, oh yes, this one is truly something else. The nurse who refused to enter room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak, but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall. The stories. The bus route no driver volunteers for anymore. Mason Kiernan had heard about Route 74 from older drivers, who spoke in quiet tones that never carried far. They said the trouble started in the late 2010s after a strange series of reports reached dispatch. Nothing dramatic was proven, yet every account shared the same route and the same stretch of road. Mason was 34 with 6 years on the job, and he handled his shifts without much worry. He covered suburban loops near a quiet industrial strip, and most days followed a predictable pattern. He enjoyed the routine since it felt steady and harmless. When his supervisor asked him to cover Route 74 one cloudy afternoon, he agreed before he remembered the warnings. He showed up early at the depot that day, hoping to review the old logbooks stored in a dusty metal drawer near the operations office. The previous drivers had left short notes that felt rushed and uneasy. One entry from late 2016 mentioned a recorded thump on the rear exterior panel that matched no visible damage. Another entry filed in early 2018 reported an unknown passenger leaving muddy prints that ended halfway down the aisle. Mason drove out a little before 4 that afternoon. The route crossed through residential blocks before curving toward the old mill road that ran along an abandoned railway cut. He planned to complete the loop without focusing on the rumors. The bus felt solid, and the passengers were few. A pair of teenagers sat near the middle seats while an elderly man checked his phone with slow movements. The incident started as Mason merged onto the mill road. His side mirror reflected something darker than the usual late daylight. He caught a shape near the tree line that looked like a person leaning slightly forward. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it was nothing unusual, since shadows often stretched strangely near wooded areas. Still, he noticed the elderly man glancing toward the same window, as if he had sensed something too. A mile later, the teenagers hit the stop cord. Mason opened the doors, and they stepped out onto a fading concrete pad. As the doors shut, one of them tapped the glass and pointed toward the rear of the bus. Mason reversed the angle of his mirror and saw a smear across the lower panel. It looked wet, like someone dragged a hand along the metal. He checked the road behind him and saw no one there. The teenagers shrugged before walking away. Mason continued toward the loop turn, focusing on the sound of the engine. The noise seemed slightly off-pitch. He kept his speed steady, but sensed a weight shift near the rear section. The elderly passenger moved closer and asked if everything was all right. Mason told him the engine felt warm but stable. The man nodded and mentioned hearing a hollow tapping near the back wall. At the final stop of the loop, the elderly man stepped out, leaving Mason alone for the return run. He checked the exterior panel and found the smear dry like dust pressed by a damp glove. The shape continued a few inches beyond the edge, as if the contact started slightly off the surface. He wiped it with his sleeve and felt grainy residue flake away with an odd metallic smell. He climbed back inside and started the engine. The interior lights flickered once as the gear engaged. He made it halfway up the hill before a heavy thud sounded near the emergency exit. He braked and listened. Another softer thud followed, like something shifting its weight. He walked down the aisle with slow steps and checked each row. The seats were empty, and the air felt colder than it should for that hour. Near the back seat, he noticed a set of partial prints on the floor. They were narrower than a normal shoe, but shaped like someone walking with uneven pressure. The prints stopped exactly where previous notes claimed they ended. He crouched low and found a fragment of dried soil that did not match the usual clay from the area. It held a reddish tint closer to iron dust from the old mill yard. Mason reached dispatch through the radio and reported the noises. The operator told him to return the bus for inspection, since archived calls from earlier years mentioned similar sounds. He kept the radio open as he returned to the wheel. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. On the way back, he passed the same hill where he had seen the shadow near the trees. The mirror caught movement again. This time, he saw a figure standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder. The figure wore something loose that blended with the background. The face seemed pale, though he could not see details clearly. The figure vanished between glances without any sign of retreat. A minute later, a faint tapping started along the rear exterior. It rose in 3 short bursts that matched a steady rhythm. He recognized a pattern similar to someone hitting metal to test thickness. He held the wheel tight and kept driving until the depot gates came into view. Mechanics met him near the garage. They checked the exterior and found thin scratches near the rear panel that shaped a curved line not caused by branches. The residue he had wiped earlier fell into a small tray and produced a metallic odor stronger than before. One mechanic mentioned that earlier logs described identical residue after drivers reported seeing a lone figure near the mill road in late 2017. The supervisor asked Mason to retrace the interior for any objects left behind. He searched each row with a handheld light. Near the same spot where the prints ended, he found a torn strip of cloth hanging from the seat frame. It felt oddly cold, even under the warm light. The cloth carried the same reddish tint as the soil fragment. Later that night, the depot reviewed old dash recordings from previous years. Most footage showed nothing more than faint reflections. However, one clip from mid-2019 captured a blurred outline moving along the side of a passing bus. The outline kept pace for several seconds before fading near the same hill where Mason saw the figure. Investigators compared the footage with archived local reports. They found mention of a worker who disappeared near the mill site in late 2015. The report never confirmed foul play, and the search ended without results. There was no official link connecting that case to the strange events on the route, yet the timing matched the earliest driver notes. Mason stayed quiet as the supervisor reviewed the findings. The bus still sat idling with a low rumble that hummed through the concrete floor. A mechanic tapped the rear panel and noted that the metal vibrated oddly like a surface recently struck from the outside. Another mechanic mentioned hearing a faint echo that felt delayed by half a second. The depot decided to suspend Route 74 until the buses could be tested. Drivers whispered that the figure near the hill might be tied to the worker who vanished years earlier. No one claimed solid proof, yet the pattern of sightings, sounds, and residue lined up too closely to ignore. The supervisor circulated a memo explaining that the route posed operational risks due to repeated, unexplained interference. Mason drove home that night feeling the weight of everything he had seen. He replayed the moment when the figure appeared in the mirror. He tried to decide if it looked like a person seeking help or a shape formed by shifting shadows. The cloth fragment still felt cold in his memory, though he never touched it again. In the weeks after the suspension, several commuters asked why the route closed. Officials told them the road required maintenance due to instability near the railway cut. Only a few people mentioned the old rumors. Some said they once saw someone walking the hill at dusk, though none described a clear face. Mason returned to his regular loop and kept his focus on safe runs. He never requested Route 74 again. Whenever the topic surfaced among drivers, he listened quietly without adding his story. He knew what he had heard and seen on that road. He also knew that the evidence, while thin, repeated across years with unsettling consistency. The depot finally retired the buses assigned to that route. They stored them in a corner lot away from the main garage. On calm nights, staff claimed to hear soft taps on the panels as if something moved inside the old shells. No one investigated because the sounds stopped whenever a door opened. Each time Mason passed the lot, he felt a chill rise along his arms. He believed the events were real, even if no official report could confirm them. Route 74 remained closed, and no driver stepped forward to revive it. The story faded from public view, yet those who worked at the depot understood why the route stayed empty. They remembered how it felt to sense a presence following the bus, and they knew some roads carry histories that never fully settle. The stories. The mine shaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else. A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise, since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mine shaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. This photograph found in a mailbox changed everything. The photograph turned up inside a rusted mailbox behind an old duplex that once housed 3 families during the late 2010s. It reportedly connected to an unsolved disturbance that drew police cars for weeks without any formal statement from local officials. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a junior claims adjuster who spent most days reviewing accident photos sent by clients across the region. He had driven out to the duplex to help his cousin move into a cheaper place after a messy breakup that happened earlier that year. He wanted a quiet afternoon with simple tasks that could end before dark, since the neighborhood felt uneasy even in daylight. The plan changed when he noticed the leaning mailbox behind the fence with its lid jammed open from years of sun damage. Something inside caught the light in a way that bothered him, and he reached in without thinking much about it. His hand closed on a stiff envelope with no stamps and only a smudged date that looked like it read 2014. Inside was a single photograph that showed the back lot of the same duplex, with a figure standing near a basement door. The figure seemed to stare at the camera, even though the face was blurred under the bright reflection that hit the glossy print. A handwritten note on the bottom edge read, "He never left," and the words felt rushed, as if written during real fear. Rylan showed the photo to his cousin, who shrugged and said the basement had been locked for years due to repeated flooding. His cousin had heard faint stories from the previous tenant, who claimed someone used to sleep down there during colder months. Nothing in the story felt sharp enough to explain the strange energy captured in the photograph. Rylan slipped the photo in his backpack, then walked around the duplex yard for a better look at the angle shown in the print. He matched the line of the fence and the shadows from a nearby power pole until he reached the exact spot where the unknown person once stood. His phone timestamp showed late afternoon, yet a sudden chill moved through the air even though the day had been warm. He took a quick photo of the canal behind the duplex to document conditions, since he handled evidence types for work and trusted that habit. Something shifted behind the basement door, and he stepped back while telling himself it was only loose wood pushed by the wind. The handle rattled once, which unsettled him more than he expected. A neighbor named Corby Henshaw walked out from the adjacent unit and asked if Rylan was looking for the old inspector who used to check the lot. Corby looked about 50 and carried a half-empty grocery bag that gave off a faint scent of detergent and onions. He said the inspector came around every few months to confirm no one had broken into the basement. Rylan showed Corby the photo, and the man stiffened before saying he recognized the reflection pattern on the figure's jacket. Corby claimed the image matched a maintenance worker named Talon Griggs, who vanished from the property in late 2014. According to Corby, the disappearance never gained attention because Talon was young and moved often without telling anyone. Rylan asked if police ever searched the duplex, but Corby said they mostly checked paperwork, then suggested Talon left town for seasonal work. Corby lowered his voice and explained that several tenants reported hearing dragging sounds under the floor during storms after Talon went missing. Rylan listened with growing concern because the basement clearly leaked heavily and could hide debris without much notice. He returned to the basement door and studied the warped wood for any sign of fresh marks that might show recent attempts to enter. A faint groove near the latch suggested someone had slipped a tool inside within the last few months. His job trained him to recognize forced entry signs even when the damage seemed minor. Rylan decided to search public records at the small municipal office across town to see if any maintenance reports mentioned Talon. An older clerk named Mavis Kelter helped him check archived building logs that covered routine inspections and emergency calls. She located a brief entry from late 2014 stating that the maintenance worker assigned to the duplex never completed his shift. The entry ended with a note about a tenant hearing a loud crash near the canal path behind the property that same evening. No follow-up report existed, which troubled Rylan because something clearly disrupted the worker's schedule. Mavis encouraged Rylan to check the microfilm station since older incident summaries sometimes went unprocessed in the main system. He scrolled through grainy reels until a short police dispatch log from early the next morning appeared with a simple description of possible trespasser behind duplex. The log ended without resolution, yet 2 initials of responding officers matched names Rylan recognized from regional accident investigations. It remained unclear why the officers never wrote a complete summary. Rylan contacted a former coworker who now handled risk assessments for vacant structures and asked if he recalled any issues near that duplex. The coworker remembered an odd request from a landlord who wanted an estimate for reinforcement of a basement hatch rather than a full cleanup. That recommendation was denied due to insufficient documentation, which meant the door probably stayed weak for years. Rylan returned to the duplex the next morning and found the backyard quiet except for the hum of distant traffic along the main road. He held the original photograph beside the current view and noticed a missing gutter downspout that once directed runoff away from the basement. Water had carved a shallow trench that led directly to the exact spot where tenants heard dragging noises during storms. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear against the wood to check for echoes that could reveal hidden cavities behind the interior wall. A faint hollow sound suggested a gap large enough to hide debris that might include personal items left by Talon. He reached for the handle, which gave slightly, as if someone recently replaced a rusted hinge without securing it tightly. Corby approached again and warned Rylan that previous tenants avoided the basement after a courier discovered an old backpack wedged behind a drain pipe. The courier returned the bag to the landlord, who claimed it belonged to a temporary worker, yet no one retrieved it. Rylan realized this detail lined up with the approximate time of Talon's disappearance. He asked Corby where the landlord moved and learned the man relocated to another county after selling the duplex in 2021. Rylan checked property records later that day and found a short transfer note indicating the landlord left behind several unclaimed storage boxes. Those boxes were marked as low priority during cleanup, which meant their contents might still sit in a small maintenance shed. Rylan walked to the shed behind the duplex and spotted 3 dust-covered boxes stacked under a sagging roof tile that drooped toward the canal. Inside one box, he found scattered papers, including an old shift sheet with Talon's name and a checklist mentioning repairs near the basement hatch. Another page listed a complaint about a foul smell rising through the floorboards after heavy rainfall. He took photos of the papers, then looked up when a sudden gust rattled the shed door hard enough to shake loose dried leaves. The wind pushed a loose shingle that clattered onto the ground near his feet and broke apart in a puff of dust. The noise startled him, but reminded him that the property had been poorly maintained for years, which supported the idea of an overlooked accident. Rylan returned to the basement and used a small pry bar from his cousin's toolbox to loosen the frame without causing obvious damage. The door opened with a dull crack that carried through the quiet yard like a tired breath escaping from a sealed room. A wave of stale air rolled out, followed by the faint scent of metal and wet soil. He stepped inside and turned his phone flashlight toward the far wall where the drainage pipe curved behind a pile of rotten boards. Something glittered near the edge of the light, and he reached down to pick up a crushed reflective jacket with a missing zipper. The reflective pattern matched the same glare seen on the figure in the original photograph. A small utility tag sewn to the jacket listed the initials TG, which aligned with Talon Griggs, and confirmed Rylan had found evidence connected to the missing worker. He dug through debris nearby and uncovered an old clipboard that held one final maintenance note describing a sudden collapse caused by shifting soil near the hatch. It suggested Talon was preparing to reinforce the area before something destabilized the ground. Rylan followed the damaged soil path toward a narrow cavity under the floor where water pooled during storms and carried loose items into deeper pockets of mud. He found scattered tools with dried corrosion that indicated the worker likely became trapped by collapsing debris during heavy rainfall. The shifting soil and poor structure could have hidden the incident from sight for years. He contacted local authorities who reopened the case and confirmed the basement conditions created a perfect scenario for an unnoticed accident involving a lone worker. Officers documented the findings and credited Rylan's persistence for revealing the long-ignored evidence that connected the photograph to the missing maintenance report. Corby watched from the fence with a quiet expression that mixed relief with sorrow. Weeks later, Rylan returned to the duplex before his cousin finished moving in and paused near the mailbox where he first found the photo. The rusted metal still leaned forward, as if trying to offer one final warning about secrets left unmanaged in quiet neighborhoods. He understood now that the image was not a threat, but a trace of someone trying to signal unfinished work. He placed a small flower near the fence, then stepped back toward his car while thinking about how easily small details vanish when people move on. The photograph no longer felt ominous because its message became clear through patient evidence and careful listening to forgotten reports. Rylan left with a quiet respect for the worker whose final shift had been frozen in that single frame. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. The fisherman who kept hearing his name over the radio. Evan Carr spent most mornings on the narrow inlet where the water carried old radio chatter from nearby boats. Local crews reported that odd transmissions sometimes drifted through that stretch, and many believed they came from abandoned gear left after storms. He treated those stories like tired dock rumors until one calm morning changed his thinking. Evan was 38 and worked as a small-scale fisherman who supplied a few markets inland. He kept his aluminum skiff tied near the inlet because the currents stayed gentle and the tides rarely pushed hard. He headed out around sunrise on a day in early summer 2019 with a simple goal to check crab pots he set the night before. He liked the quiet and usually ignored the static coming from his battered radio. He started the motor, then steered toward his first buoy, while soft wind pushed light ripples across the inlet. He reached for his thermos when the radio cracked with a burst sharper than usual, which made him pause. Static hissed for several seconds, then a faint voice said his name with a slow, careful tone. It sounded like a person trying to speak through heavy interference. Evan thought it came from a nearby boat because signals often bounced across the water in unpredictable ways. He looked around but saw empty shoreline and one distant trawler that was already moving toward deeper water. The voice repeated his name with the same drawn-out sound, and he felt a sudden cold weight that did not match the warm morning. He tried to answer, but the radio only returned a faint hum that flicked in and out like something powered by a weak battery. He shut the radio off to reset it, then turned it back on, hoping the strange signal would vanish. Instead, he heard a low rhythmic tapping that reminded him of someone hitting a metal hull in slow, measured beats. Evan finished checking the first pot, but his focus kept drifting to the radio because the voice carried a dull echo that felt unnatural. He tied the pot and planned to finish the rest quickly so he could return to shore where he hoped to test the antenna. The moment he reached for the throttle, the radio shifted again and whispered his name in a tone that sounded closer than before. He headed towards shore while replaying that voice in his mind because it carried an uneasy familiarity he could not place. Dock workers later said he arrived faster than usual and looked tense as he pulled his gear onto the planks. He asked if any boat had called for him that morning, but no one reported a transmission with his name. Evan returned home and wrote down the time of each strange broadcast because he wanted to check older notes he kept on similar events. He found 2 entries from early spring that mentioned brief whispers through the radio shortly after heavy fog settled over the inlet. He ignored them at the time because the fog distorted signals and created odd echoes that bounced between cliffs. He spent the afternoon checking online forums that tracked regional marine frequencies where enthusiasts archived recordings from previous seasons. One contributor posted a thread about ghost transmissions that came from a derelict trawler that sank in the late 2010s after a major storm. According to the thread, the trawler carried a short-range radio that sometimes flickered on during low tide when exposed wiring reacted to saltwater. Witness statements from local patrol crews reported faint voices calling crew names during those periods, though no identity was ever confirmed. Evan noted that detail because the thread mentioned distorted speech patterns that matched his morning experience. He called a friend named Cal Rowan, who worked part-time with a small rescue group, and asked if the inlet held any wrecks near his route. Cal said an old survey map showed one submerged boat that rested near the deeper bend south of the inlet. He offered to meet Evan at the dock so they could check tidal charts and mark the likely location. They met near sunset and compared notes while a light breeze pushed the smell of seaweed across the planks. Cal studied Evan's written times, then said the pattern lined up with a recent series of reports about intermittent transmissions during rising tide. He suggested they record any new signal the next morning using a portable device with stronger range than Evan's aging radio. Evan agreed, even though the idea made him uneasy because the voice felt personal in a way he could not explain. Morning arrived with heavy gray sky as they motored toward the bend marked on the survey map. Evan turned on the recorder while Cal monitored the radio and watched the water shift with the incoming tide. They waited for several minutes before a burst of static cracked through the speaker with a sharp rise that made both men flinch. The voice spoke again and said Evan's name with a tone that now carried a clipped urgency. Cal looked at the recorder, then stared toward the bend because the voice sounded as if it came from somewhere below the surface. Evan gripped the wheel and tried to steady his breathing because something in the tone reminded him of an old coworker who vanished years earlier during a late-season crossing. He mentioned that coworker to Cal, who asked if the man ever sailed near this inlet. Evan said that the coworker named Reed had worked on a small crew that fished along the same coastline in early 2017. Reed later transferred to another vessel that sank during a storm that occurred north of their town. Local reports said the wreck was never fully recovered because shifting sand made the search difficult. Cal suggested they check archived dispatch logs from that storm because crews sometimes reported drifting debris that could help them understand how anything connected to Reed might reach this inlet. They returned to shore and visited a small office where a retired dispatcher kept scanned records from older calls. The dispatcher recognized Evan and allowed them to search a digital folder that stored logs from early 2017. One log described a partial sighting of a damaged trawler hull drifting south several days after the storm. The report said the hull carried broken antennas and fragments of a radio panel that still flickered when exposed to sunlight. A second log mentioned a patrol officer hearing a distant voice through static that repeated a crew name before fading. Evan realized the name in that report matched Reed's last name, but the log did not mention if the voice said anything else. He remembered that Reed had a habit of calling coworkers by last name during early morning shifts when he tried to stay awake. The connection felt loose but too strong to ignore because the timing aligned with the drifting hull. Cal said they should return to the inlet during low tide because exposed wreckage might reveal old wiring that caused recent broadcasts. Evan agreed, though his stomach tightened because the voice spoke with increasing clarity each time. They secured the skiff, then returned that afternoon when the tide receded and revealed dark shapes below the bend. They anchored near a shallow patch where twisted metal poked through sand like remnants from the storm. Evan moved closer and saw part of a radio panel caught between 2 rusted beams with wires trailing into the water. Cal used a long hook to lift a loose section and found a corroded tag that matched the radio model used on Reed's crew during 2017. The radio crackled at that moment, then delivered another faint call of Evan's name, with a tone that now carried slow rising static. Cal recorded the sound while Evan watched the wires shift with the gentle pull of the tide. He understood then that the wrecked panels sometimes connected when saltwater reached the exposed terminals, which created a short burst of power. The burst likely triggered fragments of an old emergency recording that captured voices during the storm. Evan remembered that some crews recorded internal chatter before impact, and those recordings sometimes contained rushed calls that repeated crew names. The voice in his radio may have been part of that final chatter, which echoed through damaged wiring each time conditions aligned. They brought the recording to the dispatcher, who played it through a clearer speaker. The voice echoed sharply, then faded as the static rose, which made the source obvious. It was a broken emergency loop that repeated fragments from a doomed crew's final minutes. The distorted tone made the calls sound directed, but they were simply names, shouted during chaos. Evan felt a heavy release of tension because the mystery carried a painful answer, but at least it was grounded in something real. He asked the dispatcher to contact local authorities so they could mark the wreck and prevent more confusion. Cal agreed and said the inlet should be flagged on new charts for safety. Evan returned to the water the next day and listened to his radio with a calmer mind while checking his crab pots. The inlet felt different because he now understood the source, even though the memory of the voice still lingered. He looked toward the bend where the wreck rested and thought about the crew who never returned. He continued working that season with new respect for the signals that travel across water because each transmission carried a story shaped by time and tide. He did not hear his name again and believed the loop finally failed after years of corrosion. He kept the recording in a drawer at home to remind himself that strange moments sometimes come from simple causes. He knew that calm days on the inlet now carried a quiet steadiness that felt earned after weeks of searching for answers. The stories. Never open the locker marked "staff only" at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claimed the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "staff only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with two knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Rylan decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Rylan tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Rylan jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Rylan insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Ryland described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Ryland eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. This lakeside pier hides something no one reports. Lodge crews in the region still talk about an old pier tucked behind a quiet lake that draws almost no visitors. They say the pier looks normal from a distance, yet people keep finding strange evidence near its end that never reaches public reports. In the summer of 2019, a maintenance worker named Ryland Keating drove out to that lake for a simple task. He was 29 and worked routine grounds jobs for a small county crew. That day, he only needed to replace a warped board along the outer section of the pier. He liked the lake because it stayed calm even during busy seasons, and he figured the job would be quick enough to finish before lunch. When he parked near the tree line, he noticed the lot was empty, which felt odd because anglers usually arrived before dawn. The air felt thick, and the water looked darker than usual, yet he kept moving because the repair order had been waiting all week. He set his toolbox near the first post, then started walking along the pier to check for softboards before carrying supplies to the far section. Halfway across, he heard a short knock against the underside of the pier, which he assumed came from drifting debris. He leaned over the edge to look for logs, but saw nothing moving. The sound happened again, just 2 boards ahead, and this time he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He stepped back and tried to decide if the pier was shifting because of wind, but the lake's surface stayed flat without any waves. He reached the final stretch where the railing changed from new planks to older, weathered pieces. A notebook sat against the inner corner near the last post, which made him freeze because the crew did not store items out there. The notebook looked soaked along the edges, and several pages had stuck together. He picked it up and flipped through the front until he found a name that he did not recognize. The entry mentioned fishing conditions from early spring and included a rough drawing of the lake that ended with a short line stating the water felt wrong that day. He set the notebook down and crouched to check the damaged board that needed replacing. When he pulled the old plank free, he spotted a small metal badge wedged between the beams. It had no markings other than deep scratch lines that looked deliberate. The badge felt cold and heavy despite the warm morning air. He wiped away dirt, then placed it inside his shirt pocket because he wanted to check county records later. Ryland returned to his truck for the replacement board and felt uneasy during the walk back because the knocking sound continued at irregular intervals. When he reached the trunk, he noticed mud streaks on his rear bumper that did not match his earlier tracks. The streaks started near the center, then curved down toward the gravel, as if someone had leaned against the vehicle. He looked around the empty lot and called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer came back. He carried the new plank to the end of the pier and installed it quickly because he wanted to leave. While tightening the final screw, he heard a voice from the tree line near the far side of the lake. The words were hard to understand, yet the tone sounded urgent. He turned and scanned the shoreline, but saw no movement except for a faint ripple near the reeds. He stood still and waited for another sound, then heard what he thought was the same voice repeating a short phrase. The wind picked up, which carried the sound across the water in a strange pattern that made it difficult to pinpoint the source. He packed his tools and walked back toward the lot. Before reaching the shore, he noticed footprints near the first post that looked fresh. They were smaller than his boots and pressed deeply into the wood, which suggested someone had been standing there minutes earlier. He followed the prints for a short distance until they looped back toward the reeds and stopped abruptly where the boards felt damp. When Ryland returned to the office, he turned in the repair report and mentioned the found notebook and badge. His supervisor asked him to set both items on a side shelf until someone from records could examine them. That afternoon, the supervisor checked archival calls for that area and found references to an unconfirmed missing angler from early spring. The angler had signed in at the visitor kiosk but never signed out. Crews searched the lake for 2 days, then scaled back when no solid evidence surfaced. Later that week, Ryland decided to look deeper into the notebook. He flipped through more pages and discovered entries describing odd pressure changes near the pier on quiet days. One entry detailed a single ripple moving against the wind and stopping precisely under the pier. Another entry described faint tapping at night that sounded mechanical. None of the entries suggested danger, but the tone shifted in the final pages as the writer mentioned seeing a person standing near the reeds who vanished before he could wave. Ryland checked weather logs for the period mentioned in the notebook and noted a rare drop in barometric pressure that occurred without a storm. He also examined an old photo stored in his phone from a visit months earlier. In the photo, the lake looked normal, yet a small shape near the reeds reflected more light than surrounding water. He zoomed in and noticed a faint outline that resembled a shoulder above the surface. He thought it might be a lighting artifact, but decided to keep the image for reference. A week later, he returned to the lake with a coworker named Laramie Downs, who handled safety inspections. Laramie was older with years of field experience and usually dismissed odd reports, yet she agreed to help because she remembered the missing angler case. They arrived early and walked the length of the pier while checking for structural issues. Laramie tapped each beam with a small tool to test for hollow spots. When she reached the section where Ryland had found the badge, she paused because the sound changed. The beam gave a dull response, like something heavy sat under the structure. Ryland lay flat on the boards and lowered his arm to feel beneath the edge. His fingers touched a cold object that felt like metal. He reached further and pulled out a thin plate with holes drilled along one side. It looked like part of an old sonar bracket, but the lake had no recorded installations. Laramie suggested checking old maintenance logs from 2005 because the county once considered adding depth sensors for safety. She also noted the plate looked corroded only on one half, which indicated it had been partially shielded from water for a long time. They carried the plate to the truck and decided to walk the shoreline before leaving. Near the reeds, they found a small indentation in the mud that resembled a knee print next to a flattened patch of grass. The mark faced the lake as if someone had been kneeling to look at something. Laramie pointed out faint parallel lines near the water, which looked like drag marks. She photographed the area, then flagged it for a follow-up survey. Back at the office, Ryland compared the bracket plate with old schematics from a short-lived depth monitoring trial. He found a drawing showing 2 test brackets installed near the pier before the project was canceled. The logs stated the devices were removed after several malfunctions, but the final report accounted for only 1 bracket. The missing bracket had apparently fallen into the lake or been removed without documentation. The scratch lines on the badge matched the spacing of the holes on the plate, which suggested they had been stored or moved together at some point. Ryland checked weather sensors near the lake for unusual readings over the past year. Several early morning reports showed sharp changes in water temperature near the pier despite stable air conditions. He also found a dispatch log from late spring describing a caller who reported seeing a person waving near the reeds before disappearing under the surface. Responders searched but found no footprints and concluded the caller may have seen a bird landing. One night, Ryland returned to the lake alone because he wanted to verify something noted in the notebook. He walked to the end of the pier and stood still, listening for tapping. The lake stayed quiet until a single knock sounded beneath the beams exactly where he had felt vibration weeks earlier. He crouched and waited, then heard a softer knock that echoed against the metal bracket he had removed. He realized the sound pattern resembled the rhythm of small waves hitting a barrier, which made little sense in calm water. He shined a flashlight into the gap where the bracket had been and saw a narrow space that opened into a small cavity under the pier. Something metallic glinted near the back wall. He reached with a long rod and pulled out a rusted hinge attached to a bent bar. The pieces looked like remnants of an improvised tool. He placed the hinge on the deck, then noticed a wet footprint forming near the end post. The shape appeared in seconds, as if someone had stepped there recently. The board around it stayed dry while the footprint darkened. Ryland backed away slowly and pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved and the air stayed silent. He waited for the footprint to fade, but it held shape for several minutes before drying unevenly. He documented the scene with his phone, then left the lake without waiting for more signs. Weeks later, the county closed the pier for extended maintenance and sealed the logs from public access. The missing angler case remained unresolved, yet several notes were added stating unexplained structural anomalies had been found near the outer section. Ryland kept copies of the notebook entries and the photo of the bright shoulder shape. He never returned to the lake, but told coworkers the pier held a mix of forgotten equipment and quiet warnings that did not reach official channels. He believed the clues pointed to someone spending secret time under the structure long before the angler disappeared. He also believed the knocking he heard came from shifting metal against trapped beams rather than anything mystical. Still, the unexplained footprint remained the detail he never understood. Today, the lake sits quiet behind dense trees, and the pier shows new boards that look identical to the old ones. Locals say nothing strange happens there anymore, and officials agree. Ryland thinks the place carries its own quiet trail of missed signs, and he hopes they stay buried where they cause no more stories. The stories. The archivist who decoded a warning inside a missing person file in a small county records office tied to a quiet mountain town, a file about a long missing hiker raised concern. It arrived without explanation in a plain envelope with an outdated seal that looked wrong to the staff. Calder Rusk was 39 and worked as an archivist who handled old case materials with careful routine. He liked quiet tasks during long shifts and kept notes about unusual items that passed through his desk. He lived outside town and drove an old sedan that handled mountain roads well. His plan that day in early autumn was simple. He wanted to finish indexing property disputes from 2008 and leave before sunset. The envelope changed that plan with a sharp interruption. Its paper felt older than the date stamp, which claimed 2015. The handwriting on the label looked rushed and uneven, which bothered him in a way he could not explain. Inside the envelope sat a missing person report about a hiker named Ryan Halper, who vanished during late summer 2015. The file included faded prints that showed a trail near a power station that had closed years earlier, according to county logs. A short field note from an unnamed deputy was clipped inside the report, and that detail confused Calder. The deputy note carried a single line that read, "A warning was heard near the ridge before we lost contact." There was no signature and no follow-up page, which conflicted with what Calder had learned about normal procedure. He checked the index card drawer for the deputy roster from that year. He found a roster with a missing entry number that hinted at an unfiled edition. Calder decided to verify the report by checking archive dispatch summaries kept in a separate compact shelf. He pulled a binder marked Summer Cases 2015 and scanned each page with slow care. One entry mentioned a static-filled call from an officer near the old ridge trail where the hiker vanished. It noted that the call ended after a loud crack reported by dispatch staff. He compared the time of that call with a note in the missing person report and noticed a mismatch that felt important. The report claimed the call never connected, yet the dispatch summary claimed it lasted several minutes. He wrote both details in his notebook because he wanted a clear timeline. He planned to confirm the timestamps using recorded reel backups stored in a temperature-controlled locker below the office. The reel system was old but reliable and required a special key that he kept on a wrist chain for emergency work. He unlocked the cabinet and threaded the reel for the afternoon of the hiker disappearance. The recording started with normal chatter about trail conditions that matched weather logs filed that week. It shifted after a faint voice cut through the static, repeating a short phrase. The phrase sounded like "stay above the red markers," which made Calder pause because the trail maps from that year used blue markers. He replayed that section several times and heard a second voice say the markers were changed without notice earlier that month. He checked a laminated map from 2015 stored in a drawer down the hall. The map showed blue markers along the ridge, despite the comment on the reel. Calder wondered if someone updated the trail signs unofficially, which could confuse hikers unfamiliar with the area. He called a retired ranger named Ballen who sometimes answered questions about old trail conditions. Ballen told him that a volunteer crew repainted the ridge trail during late summer 2015 due to erosion damage. He added that the crew reported a missing paint supply that delayed work during the final week. This detail matched a line in the missing person report that mentioned a misplaced equipment crate near the ridge boundary. Calder believed the misplaced crate might explain the repainted markers if someone used the wrong color during rushed repairs. He added that thought to his notes and checked weather data again. He found that a storm hit the ridge that same evening, which might have washed away parts of the trail. He returned to the file and noticed a small fold at the corner of a photo that revealed another handwritten line. The line said the warning was not meant for us, which made him uneasy because it echoed the earlier note from the deputy. He held the photo under a desk lamp and saw faint indentations behind the words. The indentations looked like someone wrote a longer message on a removed page. Calder used a soft graphite stick to shade the back of the photo gently, which revealed fragments of a sentence. The fragments read trail shift noted after rails collapsed, which pointed to structural issues near the Ridge Power Station. He checked maintenance logs kept before the station closed in 2011. The logs confirmed repeated warnings about unstable railings near the ridge overlook. He suspected the missing hiker might have walked near that overlook after the storm started, which could explain the disappearance. He searched the envelope again and found a small memory card taped under the inner flap. The card held a short audio clip recorded by someone walking uphill during strong wind. The clip ended with the same phrase heard in the reel, "Stay above the red markers," spoken by a strained voice. Calder compared the wind noise from the clip with weather station data and concluded it matched the storm peak that evening. He realized the warning might have been directed at the volunteer crew who repainted the trail and not at search teams. The crew may have marked a detour with red signs that never made it onto the official map. That possibility explained the conflicting colors noted in the reel. He formed a theory that the hiker followed the new red markers, which led toward the unstable overlook rather than the safe path. The missing crate and rushed repairs might have contributed to poor placement of those temporary signs. Calder wrote a summary that connected the deputy note, the audio clip, and the map inconsistencies. He delivered the summary to his supervisor, who agreed to send it to county search coordinators for review. In the following days, a review team hiked the ridge and found remnants of weathered red paint on a fallen post near the overlook. They also found metal fragments that matched railings documented in the 2011 maintenance logs. These findings supported Calder's belief that the hiker followed an unofficial detour that collapsed during the storm. Calder knew the case remained unresolved, yet he felt the evidence finally clarified the warning inside the file. The message pointed to a rushed trail change that confused both hikers and responders back in 2015. As he closed the binder, he realized some files waited years for someone to read them in the right order. He locked the envelope in a secure drawer and left the office with a quiet sense of closure. The stories. What's buried beneath that motel parking lot? In 2013, a small highway motel outside a rural town gained quiet attention after workers found strange soil layers under fresh asphalt. The case never reached headlines, but locals still mention it when strange noises come from the empty lot at night. The story centers on Rylan Mercer, who was 29 and worked as a nighttime maintenance tech at the old roadside place. He lived in a small room near the supply shed and handled plumbing issues plus late check-ins during slow months. On a chilly night in early autumn, he planned to replace worn bulbs along the back walkway before closing the service desk. He walked out toward the alley where the lot met a row of overgrown trees that blocked wind from the highway. He carried a small tool bag and wanted to finish the job before storms reached the ridge. He heard gravel shift under a passing truck but ignored it and kept moving toward the flickering lights. The first incident happened when he tried to pull a ladder from storage and felt the ground dip under his feet with a dull cracking sound. He stepped back fast because the asphalt felt soft in one oddly shaped patch near an older drainage grate. He knelt with caution and pushed a screwdriver into the crack, but found soil that felt looser than normal fill. Rylan went inside and wrote a brief note about the issue, because the motel owner wanted records of every minor repair. He grabbed a flashlight and returned outside to check the area again, since guests sometimes reported old pipes vibrating under the lot. He pressed his heel against the weakened spot and felt a faint vibration that did not match normal pipe flow. The complication grew after he asked an older guest named Hollis Grant if he had heard unusual sounds during his stay. Hollis said he heard steady tapping under the pavement around midnight 2 nights earlier. He said the tapping felt rhythmic in a slow pattern that reminded him of someone knocking through thin wood. Rylan wrote the detail in his small notebook because he wanted a full record for the owner. The next morning, he looked at archived maintenance logs stored in a dusty drawer near the office printer. He found an entry from 2009 that noted settling issues under the same section of the lot without any follow-up record. The note simply said that workers filled a shallow dip with recycled asphalt after heavy rain, but never investigated deeper layers. He walked back outside and scraped away loose chunks of pavement until he reached a thin patch of older concrete mixed with cracked gravel. He noticed faint marks in the old material that looked like parallel lines spaced evenly in a pattern similar to a box lid. He pushed his flashlight beam through the cracks and saw a dark void below the thin concrete sheet. Rylan called his friend Linton Fry, who worked part-time with a local cleanup crew that handled abandoned structures. Linton arrived after lunch and helped test the hollow area with a short steel rod used for soil checks. The rod dropped several inches into the void and produced a hollow thump that sounded too sharp for natural erosion pockets. Ryland felt uneasy but wanted clear evidence before alerting the owner. They cut a small square in the weakened concrete using an old rotary tool from the supply shed. Dust scattered across gravel as the square lifted with surprising ease. Underneath was compacted dirt mixed with thin scraps of plastic that looked melted by heat. Ryland reached in and pulled out a small strip with faded printing that looked like part of a safety warning from older storage bins. The deeper investigation started when Ryland found an old photo taped inside the maintenance log he borrowed from 2009. The photo showed the lot before renovations in 2006 and included a small storage cabin that no longer existed. A handwritten note on the back said the cabin caught fire during a storm, but details were never shared with newer staff. Ryland asked the owner about it, but only received a quiet answer that the cabin was removed after a minor electrical issue. Ryland then checked archive dispatch logs stored at the county library and found a brief call from July 2006 that reported a small fire near a roadside property matching the motel's mile marker. The call mentioned unknown materials stored inside an abandoned cabin that smoldered before firefighters cleared debris. No injuries were reported, but the log said a chemical odor lingered during the cleanup. He returned to the void under the lot and dug deeper with a small garden trowel he kept for landscaping tasks. 2 inches down, he uncovered brittle wood fibers coated in a hardened black residue that smelled faintly metallic. Linton suggested the residue looked similar to burned plastic from older industrial crates. They kept digging until the trowel struck a thin metal edge shaped like a corner bracket. They widened the hole and exposed a rectangular metal frame with charred wood inside, almost like a collapsed storage box left under the ground during repaving. Ryland found a faded barcode sticker fused to the metal, but the numbers were unreadable, except for the last 3 digits, which appeared as 416. He checked supplier records from the motel office and saw older inventory tags that used long strings, ending with the same 3 digits. The tags belonged to a discontinued supplier that shipped chemical cleaning agents in reinforced boxes. The twist came when Ryland realized the rhythmic tapping reported by Hollis might connect to shifting air pockets trapped under warped metal panels. He tested the theory by placing a board over the hollow section and stepping on different spots. Each step produced a soft knock from moving metal that echoed through the buried frame. The tapping was not from a person, but from trapped panels flexing after years of underground corrosion. He called the motel owner again with all findings and explained that the lot might contain remnants of a burned supply cabin that crews buried instead of removing fully during renovations. The owner sighed and admitted he purchased the property after the fire and assumed everything had been cleared by the previous crew. He agreed to bring in a licensed team to remove remaining material. When the cleanup team started work, they found several melted storage boxes that had fused together during the 2006 fire. The boxes contained expired solvent containers that ruptured during heat exposure. Crews confirmed the ash smell came from plastic and wood that settled unevenly under asphalt after the rushed renovation. They transported the debris to a proper disposal site and filled the cavity with stable soil. After workers repaired the pavement, Ryland walked the lot at dusk and listened for any sign of hidden noise. The tapping had stopped, and the ground felt firm under every step. He wrote a final note describing the discovery and placed it with other logs so future staff could understand the history. People still mention the motel when storms roll across the ridge because the lot glistens strangely after heavy rain. Ryland thinks the glimmer comes from newer asphalt mixing with old gravel, but he also knows that memories of buried things often linger longer than anyone expects. He told Linton the mystery felt smaller once evidence replaced fear, and Linton agreed as they locked the shed and watched distant trucks roll past on the quiet highway.